Now we would like to present to you our next speaker, Matt Short, Product and Tech Leadership at Solana Foundation. With 12 years of experiences, Matt and his team have quickly built scalable products that have added great value to million users. They have hit the point with machine learning, infrastructure, data storage, battery improvements, and scalable decentralized state machines, or Solana, that humanity has a real opportunity to make life-changing products. And now here, he will share with us about a topic, utilizing Solana's ecosystem in your games and Dapps. So please join me to welcome Matt Short.
Quite the intro. Yeah, thanks for having everyone. Thanks, Erica, and everybody for putting this on. This is great. Oh, great. So today, I'm going to talk about the ecosystem for games on Solana. Yeah, so let's get right into it. So kind of the problem that the blockchain kind of runs into a lot of times is, deciding like, if I want to explore blockchain, what does that mean? How do I actually use it to enhance my experience? Is it too difficult? Is the cost-benefit analysis right? And so one of the things that we've kind of explored is like go down to base principles. Like what is the blockchain when you're looking at different options? Ultimately, it's your game's backend. Certainly, there's a token attached to it that prevents spam. So there's a value approach attached to it. There's this foundation involved. There's people developing on it. But ultimately, it's a data store where you can have some functionality. It's a backend. And so when you're thinking about the backend, it's like what's going to offer you the best user experience based on that backend. You have gamers are very, very fickle. They have very intense performance assumptions around their backend, or their experience really. They don't necessarily need to know networking or anything like that. They know when they click on a button if they get the thing in a reasonable time, if they can send off a bunch, if the functionality is there. So the games that matter a lot for this, like if you have a PFP project where I just sit with my PFP, it may not matter quite as much, a lot of the performance. But for a game, especially a multiplayer game, where you have a lot of interactivity between players and there's a lot of social interaction and maybe they want to build on top of you, those are kind of the really why blockchain and why maybe a performance backend matters. Because there'll be a lot more activity presumably on that. So internally we kind of think about all the time, like our KPIs or whatever. We think about verified on-chain transaction. Like what is the chain actually able to do? There's a lot of theoretical things talked about today or in the industry. There's a lot of noise. So what is actually happening live? And what's the trajectory of where that's gone from? And then full finality time, which is pretty simply just I'm a player, I press the button to get the thing, and then how fast do I securely get the thing? And so on Solana, we have observed in a live environment and for sustained periods of time, over 6,000 transactions per second. This is a pretty monumental number. Solana already does more transactions per day than any other blockchain from apps, non-voting, just and this can fit all other blockchains combined inside of it. So I think the totality of maybe all other blockchains is somewhere on the order of like 200 TPS. And this is 6,000 TPS. And this matters too when you think about your app. So as your app scales, Solana scales this in a shared state. I don't need to fragment my app across multiple blockchains or other things as you think about side chains. So like if I'm a successful side chain right now, like say on an EVM architecture, yes, I am on my own chain. I don't have to compete with other activity, but I can probably only max out from anywhere from between 20 to 60 TPS, maybe up to 80, depending on the architecture. That's about the limit of the EVM as it stands today. Even ZK rollups, even all these other things, they really haven't been able to exceed that. So it's really important when you're thinking about the long-term longevity of even your own app versus your own traffic. What is your backend able to do? This is a pretty darn good app. So like I guess I'll get into the case of STEPN a little bit later to describe that a little bit. The other aspect that we really think about is full finality time. Again, that's, I click on the button, I'm a player. How long does it take for me to get that asset? The other thing that we see in Solana is very fast full finality time. So this is like under 2.5 seconds on average. This is basically Web 2 speeds. If I was going to go to the gas station, put in my credit card, put in a little thing, it would do a little spinny thing, and then probably around 2 seconds, depending on where I am, latency of the whatever, it'd probably be around this time. This is around the expectation of a player. And you can even do some things that can kind of abstract this away. And by the way, this is average. So it's not, so you can even do enhancements off this and things like that. So this is why we're really excited. Again, go back to like a little bit technical about this, because a lot of people will advertise just their block times or just one part of the confirmation stack. But really, it's kind of everything. It's the networking around it. I send my transaction to the RPC node, the blocks, how smooth is the block transition? So proof of history on Solana makes it so every block happens right next to each other as tightly as possible. It's really hard to simulate that on another network. In fact, Ethereum moving from proof of work to proof of stake helps that, because it's a little bit more deterministic who's going to be going next. It's the way they decide the next block. It helps, but nothing is as smooth of a transition as Solana, which is actually why a lot of the ZK rollups, they'll use a single sequencer because they haven't been able to solve that problem. And so to use a single sequencer, they can then bring them in order transactions much easier, because if they were trying to pass it from different sequencer to different sequencer, it's really hard, even with a system like efficient like ZK rollups, they would have a lot of gaps in there. And gaps really matter for your overall throughput time, because especially when you're trying to lower the block speed, because that becomes a higher and higher percentage of the overall transaction time. So the block times on Solana are around 0.4 to 0.5 seconds, depending on time. So if you add in like 0.1 seconds, that would be for a gap between blocks, that'd be a 20% increase. So it's really important as you try to reduce all the bottlenecks into the system. So anyway, this is probably getting a little bit too technical. You got the engineer up here, but I just want to make sure that there is true tech differentiation that is being observed live. Like I said, this is live. This is today. Users go on this, and this is part of the reason why we're seeing so much economic activity on Solana. The other thing to talk about is all of this is happening, the 6,000 transactions per second, this really, really fast response times with ridiculously low fees. I don't know if anybody was here at the Cronus 1 talk talking about MEV. And it's really kind of funny, I guess, from our perspective, hearing the MEV perspective, because things that he'll say as like a negative is like a positive for us. Like he's like, this is good, this is bad, or whatever. And so he was representing the fast block times as bad for MEV. But what it means is that the cost structure, like boil it down, like being harder to do MEV on Solana is just a fancy way of saying there's less people who are arbitrarily extracting value from the ecosystem. And that is the MEV part, but then the core protocol itself also charges really, really, really low fees. So with 6,000 transactions per second, they're happening at 0.00016. And now a lot of other L2s and L1s will claim sub-cent because, cognitively in our minds we think sub-cent, or anything under 1 cent is that's cheap. The consumer won't care. And I would argue that even if the consumer cares, as your app scales, it matters. So this number isn't even really made up. This is STEPN. This is STEPN over a quarter. StepN is a move to earn app that was really popular in the spring and still is doing a lot of user volume. Anyway, that doesn't really matter which app it is. If you're an app that's doing a really good amount of transactions, and that's how you make money in blockchain as a developer typically, number of transactions, because you either earn a royalty on the NFT sale, or on a swap you can take a basis point or two, some basis points. So you're really trying to facilitate economic and transaction activity for most of your apps, especially in games. This is typically how they're doing it. So this number really matters. How much during that economic activity is the network itself extracting? So, okay, it's still there. So the important thing to also note is if these other chains, you start reaching this type of transaction volume on another chain, the fees would spike even higher because they have these fee markets. And I'll get into that a little bit about how the protocol is on Solana staying cheap without overly aggressively using fee markets. But this is really meaningful, obviously. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars over time, even against the cheap L2s and L1s. So yeah, this is StepN, which I mentioned previously. They're a hacker house project from last September or something. They have a lot of users, especially by crypto standards. At one time, it was easily the largest app in all of crypto by number of users. And so it was doing more, so again, there was times where it was doing something like 200 to 300 transactions per second, handles just fine on the Solana network. That would fit in no subnet, supernet, sidechain in existence. They would have had to figure out a way to either fragment their own app, different marketplaces or something like that, or they would have had to, the fees would have spiked to then curtail some of those transactions. And again, those fees would have gone to the network, not to StepN, and they would have seen less overall transfers, which means, again, another part of less revenue. See how that works? It kind of compounds, and this is part of the reason that StepN was able to make $122 million just in Q2. That's profit. Profit. And it's because all the things I've talked about today, like the number of transactions, the user experience, the lower transaction fees, these are just why is something 10x better than that other thing. And so you just start adding these across the entire stack, and you're like, oh, okay, this is great. This is why you have these compounding effects and why Solana is seeing so much user adoption. I think there's this narrative out there because Ethereum is out for so much longer and there's a lot of people who have the token and there's a lot of visibility into it that the things that Solana are just kind of a flash in the pan or there's just some weird aberration or whatever. It's like, no, there are fundamentals going on here that really matter to app builders who see into the future. So or see how things are progressing. So StepN saw, one, this fee structure that their app could actually scale with it, and two, another really important thing to talk about today is how you actually develop on Solana. So Solana gets a lot of flack for being hard to develop because it is Rust. It's not EVM yet. We'll get in that in a second. But yeah, to deploy on-chain code, custom on-chain code, you need to deploy Rust. But even apps like StepN didn't have to. So there's a protocol called Metaplex, which defines the NFT standards. There's an SPL token. Basically, one of the efficiencies that Solana has made is that for standards, you don't need to redeploy the smart contract. You use, as the app builders, can use existing audited on-chain code to deploy NFTs, fungible tokens, just like your normal tokens, and even use DEXs and DeFi, and I'll get into all the things later. But StepN was able to do their whole strategy with 2 devs and a really compelling Flutter app. Flutter is a mobile app framework. So, and they got to a very, very, very popular app just with that. They've expanded since then, so you can grow with your app as well. You can expand. They've now made their own DEX, their custom DEX, but they didn't have to start with that. So it's a really good, from a business perspective, a really easy starting point, but then you still have the ability to customize as you get product market fit in certain areas. And this is another reason why we think a lot of the consumer-facing apps on Solana are doing so well, is because they can ship quickly and then iterate. Because the way that, again, Solana works is it's functional programming. You have your base contracts, which are kind of these NFTs and fungible tokens. You can use other functionality, and then as you iterate, you can just swap out some of those functions. So you can customize different parts of the stack. You don't have to rebuild the whole stack like you do on like some of the other protocols. Yeah, so we talked about this at Korean Blockchain Week, but we were calling it the Solana Games Kit, which is basically highlighted the tip of the iceberg. So there's a whole suite of apps, starting with the SPL, which I talked about. So the SPL isn't just tokens. It's also governance. There's a name service. There's, swapping, lending, and a few other things on top of tokens that you can use. Again, just with a typical Web 2 type API. And on top of that Web 2 API, there's a JavaScript library and then a bunch of other SDKs that the community has built on top of like the game engines and other things. And on top of SPL, or even independently, there's a whole host. This is just a tip of the iceberg. I'm given 30 minutes, which is a decent amount of time, but I don't have enough time to even go through these, or let alone, there's hundreds, if not thousands of projects in the ecosystem. In fact, like head of engineering, I understand all these things on a technical level, but honestly, a lot of my job is helping ecosystem projects understand which other projects they can use. So I come in and I'm like, oh, I want some tokens and then maybe do some competitive, like sports betting. Okay, well you can actually just mint the tokens using SPL, and then you can use LootX to do the peer-to-peer wagering. You don't have to build anything on-chain. But you still get the trustlessness, you still get the on-chain visibility, you still get the interoperability, and you can build on top of it later to your needs. So it's really quick to ship those kinds of projects. Maybe, let's see, another example. Oh yeah, like DAO tooling. So Grape has integrations with Discord and a bunch of other DAOs, so you can plug and play a lot of your community management tools. So you can kind of think, maybe I'm doing an MMO, or maybe a light MMO. I don't know. MMOs are hard to make. I don't want to pitch everybody in the room to make an MMO. Yeah, so you want to just facilitate guild tooling. Well, maybe just expose Grape's tooling through an API within within a UI on your app, and then you instantly have this governance that, and the benefit of blockchain here with all of these things is that it's still stored in the public database where other people in your ecosystem can build on top of it. And this is where it gets really exciting. And I talk about this a little bit earlier with the side chain not scaling vertically to your app as it expands, but it's also a worry within fragmentation of this utility. Because Solana is scaling in a shared state, you have access to all of this. And so does everybody else. So if somebody builds in another ecosystem some really interesting guild tooling, you can expose it to your users. And so these network effects are really taking shape. And these they're like weird little NFT and game metas that are taking place on Solana, which consumers are having a really, really fun time with. How do they optimize this proof of participation to get into this Discord server that's gated by my ownership of this NFT? And we're still earlier on this. There's tons of opportunities. So if you have an idea as a tools builder, the cool thing on Solana is everybody can use it. So it's also encouraging a lot of tools builders. If you have an idea, you mint on Solana, you deploy your tool on Solana, the entire ecosystem is now your total addressable market. So it helps both sides of this marketplace. All right, yeah, oops, I went backwards. Okay. Oh, the other thing is, so we are committed to be, as least in economic terms, it's called rent seeking. But ooh, wow, I got him. So the bubblegum. So the bubblegum is basically a protocol to reduce the price of NFT minting. So transactions are super low, but super cheap, as we talked about earlier. We're now making NFTs ridiculously cheap. So you can basically mint an arbitrary amount of NFTs for 50 SOL. At the time of this, I don't know, talk maybe like $1,500. So if you just do some math, it's like a lot of zeros on per NFT. So you can mint your entire strategy for basically cheaper than it costs for like most of your backends today. And this is done through a lot of the fancy roll-up stuff that we've talked about across this. There's basically a Merkle accumulator. If anybody's interested in the architecture, you can ask me later. It's a little bit out of scope here, though. Yeah, so basically we're committed to supporting you by being the most performant and being least extractive of your apps. We know that every single fee you have to pay to the network is something that isn't going into your pocket or is a bit of a burden. Oh yeah, the other thing about this is live today. It's not production ready, I'd say, but it is on mainnet, and actively you can test it on testnet. So this isn't like an announcement of an announcement or something. This is live today. You can play around with it and see if it works for your app. I think there it goes. Okay, there's so much more that we're talking about. Yeah, I kind of already mentioned that. So here's other types of tools. So these aren't necessarily on-chain. So this is like the next step up on the stack. So you have like marketplaces like Magic Eden is notable for even passing OpenSea in overall dollar value on some days, but it consistently will have more overall transactions and more users, which matters for games because games typically aren't selling like high value one-of-ones as much. Like games typically rely on a good amount of economic activity. So having more users and having more transactions is really meaningful. There's a bunch of others like Fractal. Justin Kahn, the co-founder of Twitch, co-founded Fractal. They're developing a lot of really good tools as well, like wallets and like really good interfaces. Like some of the really good conversation earlier about UX. How do you onboard efficiently and do maybe some sort of a hybrid approach between a custodial and non-custodial. A lot of these solutions are solving those issues. So like Stardust is a good example of that. They have both a custodial onboarding that syncs with a non-custodial version, so you can kind of appeal to both parties. And you can still, within these tools, interact with the rest of the ecosystem like I was saying. You can still expose, DAO tooling and other types of tooling, wagering through these. And then the bottom row there is just all the dexes. Okay, so I guess another like really topic I'm passionate about, and part of the reason why I got back into Web3, so I guess I didn't give much of my background. I actually ran a marketplace on Ethereum in 2017, 2018. And I just didn't think that Ethereum was ready for a consumer-based application. This isn't knocking Ethereum at all. Like, it's got its really awesome use cases, and I think it's got a good future. But it just wasn't ready back then. But the reason why I came back is because I think it is ready. I think that there's technologies out there that will allow consumer-based apps, like we're already seeing it today. And I also think that it's in a few years, as we solve these consumer protection issues and on-ramp, off-ramps, and like regulatory things, and we, just like email back in the 1990s, they had to go through a lot of growing, and people were getting viruses left and right, and people were putting their credit cards into nefarious sites. We're kind of in that stage. But as the ecosystem matures, in not too different future, I think it's going to be easier to deploy an app in Web3 than it is in Web 2. And this is kind of like my general framework of that, but you're going to get both a lot of different features. The moment I deploy a token or an NFT, instantly my players have a bunch of other things that they can utilize that for. They can have community tools. I don't have to build my entire stack anymore. And I'm just collaborating with these other tools in the ecosystem that can help me build. So I think it's a really powerful concept that we'll see. And I think another thing is, to kind of say explicitly, I have marketplaces up here. That's definitely part of this. It's really great to have marketplaces for free if you mint your tokens. But I think it's not just that. And I think that's something important to think about as you think about your app strategies. I think, the next PIP is going to be, like, to sell players, why am I using blockchain? I think get it away from just the monetization thinking and think of what is the other utility. And so, that being said, the other really nice thing about Web3 is that you don't have to worry about payment providers all over the world. If I have the internet and I'm a player, I can monetize in a game. That's a really cool concept. In fact, I would say it's harder to figure out the whole download content delivery network thing than it is the payments if you're using Web3. So that's actually like indicative of my point. In like 3 or 4 years, it's going to be easier to set up a lot of the actual games and games infra and like a lot of the things that are like really cumbersome backend. Now, how do I set up payments around the world without it being incredibly extractive? Today, if a middleware payment provider offers me worldwide distribution and stuff like that, I am paying them a pretty penny to do so, whereas we already talked about the cost structure on Solana to do so. It's just way cheaper. Another thing that's really important to talk about today, I actually was talking about it outside, so I'm going to be repeating some things, but the Solana mobile stack. So we're a bunch of engineers, we're not marketers, so I don't know if our communication around this has been perfect, but what the Solana mobile stack is allowing for what's called the secure enclave in the phone. So there's a special processor that does all the really secure things on your phone. You log in, you do your fingerprint, you do your face scan, whatever you do. That actually happens in a very secure spot in the phone. None of the apps have access to your secure tokens in there, but they can use them. Your phone can tell you that you are who you are. You can do that across all your apps. It's great. It's really user-friendly. I can log into any app just using Face ID or just using my thumbprint ID. Wouldn't it be great if you can do that with crypto? That's what we're bringing. It's really that simple. We're bringing the ability to do face scanning and thumbprint verification to crypto. And the reason why we had to produce the phone itself, so the Saga, which is the flagship phone, is because it requires the manufacturer to do this. One of the things that makes it so secure is that this cryptography is happening. It needs software at shipment time to be in a secure area of the phone, because quite literally, no app or no other thing can affect the computation that's happening in that secure layer. So it needs to be the phone manufacturer that ships it. So we partnered with a company called Awesome, OSOM, to produce the phone. But it's the actual software stack, the thing that enables the Thumb ID to securely sign things. That's just an open software stack. We've started with Solana because that's what we know, but anybody can use it to program Ethereum, program other forms of cryptographic signing, and we really our goal is to sell not like hundreds of thousands of these things. If we sell just tens of thousands of them, and they're going to be good users that obviously have a decent amount of economic incentives around them, the goal is to produce other manufacturers to come along with us and to contribute code to add the EVM, to add other forms of signing. Because the ultimate goal here is, everybody in this room, I'm sure, has a cell phone. I'm sure you do a lot of things on your cell phone. And that's a lot of people that do it, that mainly interface with mobile in order to be, just be consumers. And if you don't have cryptography and you don't have blockchain to be able to interface with that level of the, consumer ecosystem, of course we are not going to reach mass adoption very easily. So this is a mass adoption play. We want to do this with the rest of the ecosystem. This is probably a decent time enough. Neon Labs is a company that in the ecosystem on Solana that is going to be rolling out full EVM support on Solana. So we're going to be trying to figure out, EVM compatibility with the stack too. And at that point, then just like, it's free reign for a lot of the L1s and L2s to also contribute to this paradigm. And again, I want to make it very clear, we're not making any money off of the open source software stack. There's no extractive thing there. We are trying to push a consumer adoption. So if you want to just fork it and just add your functionality, that's totally fine. It's a very open license. So I just want to use the last 2 minutes just kind of like things that I'm thinking about today. Like what can I guess the most important probably is like what can I give my player base by using blockchain? Like why am I minting these tokens? Why am I minting these NFTs? And again, I think if it's just a marketplace, I think I would question why I'm doing it, you know? Like I totally understand Apple's restrictive practices around the ad networks. All of them are struggling. It's really hard the unit economics around acquiring players, it's very hard. So I can understand why people are exploring blockchain just for that reason. But if the only thing you can come up with is maybe they're going to trade it back and forth a lot of times, I would really take a few more cycles and really understand what your app is going to utilize, maybe seeded from some of the things I talked about earlier in this talk. The other thing is, so Ponzonomics is basically the idea that you're paying your early players to play. And I think the reason why I say tokenomics, not Ponzonomics, you should have an idea of what the long-term sustainability of your app is. What is the steady state where I'm not just yielding tokens in order to incentivize players to play? At some point, somebody's going to have to want to pay for something. And you have to think about that transition. Maybe it is that your app requires a lot of users in order to be effective, but just know that going in. Yeah, so these are some of the things. Yeah, so I also list some resources. I think this is shared afterwards. But there's actually really good tooling nowadays on Solana. There's like a bunch of different open source tools. A lot of these are from the ecosystem, but we produce them ourselves. But it's kind of how you keep updated. The other thing I want to just touch on is Solana hasn't scaled it hasn't maxed out today. It has room to run. We've done 10 major launches. It doesn't need a Solana 2.0 to get to arbitrary number of transactions. So testnet the other day did 25,000 transactions per second. Okay. The other cool thing that I kind of touched on earlier is that with these upgrades, we can do so without raising fees. If the fee markets are localized to just one piece of state, so your app is totally unaffected by some other app having a really successful mint. I don't have enough time to explain the whole thing, but just know that we're committed to keep your fees low. You can use that QR code. It's where there's like an open source page of all the tools. And that's good. Yeah, that's my talk. There you go. Very engineering. I generated that myself.